Good. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Krishnan Girimurthy, and welcome to the first of West London Action for Children's series of summer talks. I think most of you are very familiar with the charity because you are supporters. But just in case you're not, you're one of the few who are not, let me just tell you a little bit about it. West London Action for Children was founded in 1917. It provides free counselling and therapy for vulnerable children and families in Hammersmith and Fulham and Kensington and Chelsea, providing individual therapy to children, young people and parents, family therapy, as well as groups for parents, children, dads and mindfulness groups. And they also run a stay and play group weekly. And obviously there have been huge issues thrown up by this period of lockdown and COVID-19 and loss, and people have been affected in all sorts of different ways over the last few months. But our speaker tonight can address this both head on and at various different angles, because Professor Anthony Costello studied medicine and psychology at Cambridge. He's a professor of child health. He directed the Institute for Global Health at University College London. He has studied the science of community participation through women's sympathy groups with teams in Bangladesh, India, Malawi, and Nepal. He was director of maternal, child and adolescent health at the World Health Organization. His CV goes on and forever, and I could read it for a few minutes, but you will probably know him because he's become a very well-known and familiar figure during the COVID-19 crisis as one of the key experts and commentators, and often a critical one. He's a key figure on what is called Independent SAGE, which is an alternative group of scientists led by the former Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir David King. And Anthony is an important voice on that, providing analysis and an independent voice for whoever wants to listen to it, and they hope the government. So he will also be touching on coronavirus, but Anthony is going to talk to us with a very broad and perhaps alarming title of A Future for Our Children, with a question mark at the end of it, because it really leads off a lot of work he's done recently and a recent book he's written as well. So Anthony, over to you. Anthony will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll get into some questions. You can ask questions by clicking on the chat button in Zoom and then asking your question. It is possible that you can actually ask the question on Zoom in video or audio. If you'd like to do that and talk to Anthony direct, just put an asterisk by your question. Otherwise, I will just read the questions as they go and pick out the ones that I think are most appropriate for that part of the conversation. So, Anthony, the floor is yours.
Krishnan, thank you very much. It's really great to be talking to this group. And I didn't know about your organization, and when I hear that it's 103 years old, clearly what you're doing is incredibly important. And actually what I'm going to talk about will touch upon many of the issues that you're familiar with in West London. I'm going to show host disabled screen sharing. Are you able to? Are
you unable to share your screen at the moment?
It says disabled at the moment.
Let's see if Greg can change that.
That's it. That is it. Now I just got to find where the hang on. There you go. Is that coming up? Yep.
Yes.
And there we go. Okay, listen, thank you very much. So I was at WHO until about 2 years ago. And when I was there, we were very concerned to review all of the child health policies, guidelines that we had. And a lot of them were very geared to the usual stuff of malaria, diarrhea, pneumonia. But we realized that the world had kind of moved on in the last 20 years. And although we wanted to update a lot of our technical manuals and things, we felt that there should be a commission to really look at some of the bigger, higher level issues for children in the world. And so we set up a commission which reported for 2 years before it was published in February this year. I'll give you the link later, and all of you can download this for free. And it was very interesting because we were very lucky to get as our commission co-chairs Helen Clark, who's the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and also Awa Cold-Sec, a Minister of State from Senegal. And often when you get chairs, they turn up at the end. But these were very forceful people who came to all the meetings, including one in Beirut, one in Senegal, who read everything, who contributed very actively. And it was incredibly interesting to have them. And this was part of the commission. There were actually about 40 people from all over the world. It was science-led, it was multidisciplinary, and we had a lot of very lively discussions. And of course, you could say, well, look, everything's doing well. This is what Bill Gates often says. Look, you know, if you look at, for example, mortality, child mortality rates have come down steadily in most countries. They have plateaued slightly in the last couple of years, but, you know, generally speaking, in terms of death rates, access to health services, education and the like, things have got better. But you could also argue that children are at risk like never before, because although we've seen these improvements, there are still many millions of children around the world who are suffering from hunger, sickness in conflict zones. And new threats have also started to emerge. And two of them that we were particularly concerned about were the environmental threats and the commercial threats, and I'll come on to that. Now, children in some ways in the past 2 or 3 years have been the people that are really starting to hold the older generation to account. Greta Thunberg, of course, Our House is on Fire, a memorable statement. And of course, we're all aware of the rapidity and spread of the threat from climate change. And of course, this is about our children's future, and they have every right to raise concerns. And if you look at the SDGs, that is the Sustainable Development Goals, which all governments signed up to in 2015, 17 goals. I don't know if you can see all of that there. Do you have all my pictures up on screen? I wonder if I can move that. I don't think I can.
Yeah, we can see them.
Okay, so more than 2 billion people, including at least half the world's poorest people, still live in countries affected by political fragility and conflict, and of course the additional effects of climate change. And most countries, in fact all countries, are not reporting fully on their child-related SDG indicators. So it's difficult to know what progress we're making. And to be honest, a lot of countries don't show much interest in this. The other, as I'm sure most of you will know, the business as usual scenarios right now are that there is a very high chance that we would hit a devastating level of warming, 4 degrees, by the end of this century, which is 80 years away. So within the lifetime of our youngest children. And those effects would be devastating. I won't read them out, but in a whole number of ways, they will affect children's lives and even threaten their longevity. And it is an emergency. I'm glad this event is low carbon. If there's one thing that's come out of COVID, is the reality that you can do a lot of business online, that you can do a lot of meetings online. And actually, I think I've been more productive in the last 3 months than at times where I was commuting or sitting around in meetings where you were gossiping and chatting and stuff. You tend to get the business done on Zoom and the like. Now, you will know as well as I, and I know many of you have a lot of experience in this area, that children need protection from every sector. So, you know, you need, in a sense, every ministry is concerned with children. It's not just about health ministries. So transport, road injury is the leading cause of death in older children. Clearly, agriculture and trade is absolutely vital for the economy and for food policies and the like. Urban planning for playable spaces is virtually missing from many of the newer cities as they, you know, relentlessly build and encroach upon every park and every open space. And the massive problems from air pollution, another advantage, not having planes flying over every 2 minutes and not having to suffer the kind of air pollution that is actually present in London, as you well know. And then, of course, the other issues that you know about, the violence against children, the need for family services, housing. 40% of children live in informal settlements worldwide with all of those risks. And of course, the need for libraries, schools. Again, we've seen 3 months, it's going to be 6 months of none of our children getting proper schooling. And that is an issue that affects us as well as the rest of the world. And we know from, this is from Save the Children Fund, but the UN rapporteur came last year, Professor Philip Alston, and gave some pretty condemning remarks about the UK and the levels of poverty and, you know, the gross inequalities which have multiplied over the last 2 decades at least. So, and look at London, North London particularly has the black areas on the map have, you know, and other parts of the country have really high levels of children living in poverty and without a firm home and living in hotels and the rest of it. So we, you know, more children live in poverty in wealthy countries than actually in the poorest countries. So there is this divide virtually across the world. Now with COVID, Krishnan referred to some of these problems. In health, yes, a very few children get a very serious thing called Kawasaki syndrome, but many more have suffered from anxiety, stress, loss of relatives, lack of access to health services, and around the world, certainly declines in immunization and lack of access to essential care. We've seen the education effects worldwide. We're now facing potentially a much worse recession, even a depression, some economists fear, and that will bring insecurity, poverty, food insecurity. In India, for example, malnutrition rates seem to be going up, and we may see them worsen in the latter half of this year. Domestic abuse from lockdowns. And then, of course, there's the longer term effects of conflict, possibly food riots, and governance issues, political instability and its consequences. So children suffer from this. I just want to raise 2 issues about COVID in this country, and then we can have more discussion. The first is we need a protective shield from find, test, trace, and isolate and support. We've been pointing out in Independent Sage that if you take, this is from the first month of our scheme, the number of newly infected people is about 100,000 or just under at that time. The number with symptoms is about 40% of that. Then a smaller number are referred after a positive test. A smaller number are then reached by contact tracers. And then the number of newly infected people who provide at least one contact is much smaller again. So you'll see that not tracing the contacts of the smallest number against the yellow bar is very, very substantial. A lot of people are being missed. So we don't believe we have got an effective protective shield yet. The other question is interesting. If antibody results are so low, and around the world, they're well below 10%, even in America, okay, New York is higher, but around the country and across Europe, you're getting levels of between 5 and 7%. So does that mean that the rest of us, the other 90%, are still susceptible? And I've been working with a brilliant man called Carl Friston, a professor at UCL, who is the most cited neuroscientist in the world. And he's turned his attention, he's a modeler, to COVID, and he's come up with his own very different form of modeling using principles of statistical physics. And basically, his conclusion is, if you take all of your population, the bottom bar, the total census, actually only about just over half are the effective population, because a lot of people are sequestered or shielded. And then if you look at them, only about half of those will be susceptible, in the sense that a lot of people will deal with this without symptoms or through mucosal immunity in their nose or upper respiratory tract. And then of those that do get symptoms and infected, not all of them will transmit the virus. There's quite a lot of heterogeneity there. And if you add that together, he calls this a kind of dark matter. It may be that the government's projections that you needed 60 to 80% to achieve herd immunity may not be true. It may be that it's lower. It's about 25% of people. But that's still to be worked out. But nonetheless, we are losing immunity. Immunity seems to be relatively short-lived with this virus, and that's worrying from the point of view of developing a vaccine. And the other thing is, what will be the size of the second surge? Here he modeled whether you have immunity for about 3 months, in which case you lose it, and then there will be more infections and deaths, whereas if it lasts for, say, 3 years or something, you would have a flatter curve. This is an estimate of the impact of having an effective find, test, trace, and isolate. If we don't, then you're going to have more of a surge. He estimated we might have 7,000 lives at stake over that. And the most important thing, as we've seen in Leicester, is the importance of having local information. And he's come up with a scheme to get this for every local authority. And this is an example of some of the data he's churning out for Westminster, as an example of diagrams, and a lot of the information that would be very useful to local people, because we believe a local response is very important. Another big issue, coming back to the report, is the issue of commercial marketing. Now, we've known for a long time that children are exposed to, for example, alcohol ads. Look at bottom left in Australia. 2/3 of 5 and 6-year-olds in many emerging markets could identify at least one cigarette brand, huge advertisements for e-cigarettes. But to me, the biggest issue is the emergence of social media. You won't know this, and I didn't realize this, but social media means that all of the information of your children is scooped up every day. They know about where they live, they know about their URL, they know their details, they know their gender, they know their class, they probably know where they go to school, and they work this all out from algorithms, and then they sell it. And I'm talking about Facebook, I'm talking about Google, and I'm talking about at least 10 other companies who hoover up this information, and middle companies who hoover it up and then sell it on to the bigger companies. And this means that the scale of targeting of children is absolutely massive now. And I think it's something we need to do something about, because it's the Wild West right now. And industry self-regulation doesn't work. There have been lots of studies showing that it does not hamper the propensity of the companies to advertise. And I put in about betting, because there's been a big spike in young people gambling, and you cannot watch any sporting event without seeing gambling ads all over football shirts, clubs, posters, and advertising on TV. Finally, what children told us they value was very interesting. We had some interviews in Argentina, Lebanon, Senegal, and Maori children in New Zealand. And those were the 4 things they really value, which is interesting. Family togetherness, clean environments, access to education and culture, and the opportunity to play. Not surprising maybe, but there's something that we should remember in our policy formulations. And these were some of the quotes. You can read them there, you know, from the Maori boy: playing with my extended family was the most important thing for him. When other people are happy, we're happy. When people know each other, there's less violence, and so on. So they need to be consulted in creating a world that is friendly for them and understanding their stresses and strains. Finally, we came up with 5 things, and I'll go over this very quickly. Children should be placed at the center of the Sustainable Development Goals, and shifting people towards the thought that actually policies should be about investing in the next generation, not just going for economic growth. And if you don't do that, the costs are very high. You can see this diagram in the report if you download it. The gray chunk is the scale of benefits and costs. And you can see that all around there, the water and sanitation, adolescent wellbeing, health, maternal and child health and education have huge returns on investment, something that, forgetting his name, who was the Nobel Prize winning economist? James Heckman, who won his Nobel Prize for showing the earlier you invest in children, the bigger the economic return. This sounds boring, multi-sectoral action, but it's fundamental because you need the cabinet to really put this on the table because they bang heads together. You can't just go to individual ministries, and you also need to devolve because it's easier to take multi-sectoral action at local level, that's in districts or in communities, because people will then think across the board, and you need to involve children, and we don't do that well. A third is acting on climate. I won't say much more about that. We can discuss that if you like, but clearly that's the most pressing concern. And we did, our fourth point was we came up with a child flourishing and futures profile. So we did the standard thing of ranking all countries according to whether children were flourishing using SDG indicators like mortality, nutrition, schools, all kinds of things. But we also then looked at the impact on their future from excess carbon dioxide emissions. And no country does well on both of these. So if you look at this diagram, you see that Central African Republic, bottom left, has a low flourishing index. They have high mortality rates, children are struggling, but they're obviously completely sustainable from an emissions point of view. Whereas all the rich countries who've got good flourishing are in the worst. I mean, Australia, Canada, USA. I mean, UK is a little bit better, but we're still about 150th in the world. There's only countries like Sri Lanka, Uruguay, Moldova that are really doing well on both. And this is the challenge. We're all in this together. Global health and development is all about the rich world as well as the poorest. And finally, to protect against commercial marketing, we decided that actually the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which have been in operation for 30 years actually, doesn't have anything about commercial marketing. It has very little about climate. And so we want to get together with lawyers and across the board to try and get an optional protocol added, which will then give the power to the elbow of national lawyers to come up with new legislation for children, because it's at nation state level that you get those changes. So of course it's a big report, so we want a global movement, but the key issue is to get everyone thinking about this, from the most senior political leaders through civil society, but particularly into communities, families, and get children involved themselves. The report you can download, just type in, just stick into Google Lancet, WHO, UNICEF, it will come up. And it's not that long, actually. It's about 20,000 words, I think. But you can skip through it and have a look. But I think a lot of it is quite interesting. But the key thing is what we do next. And at the moment, we're setting up a secretariat between UCL and WHO to take this forward and really monitor some of the things that we've recommended. We're looking for funding right now, but we've got the Children's Investment Fund interested, and there are others who may come on board. We had a lot of really interesting commissioners from all around the world who were very active and disputatious, I would say. That's my book and my connections. I can leave that. But I'm going to send this presentation to Heather, so if anyone wants it, and I've listed the recommendations at the end, we won't read through them now. But I think we do have to do something to really accelerate, because we've got about 10 years of carbon budget before we're heading well above 1.5 degrees and into a much more unstable climate. I think I'll stop there, Christian.
Thanks, Anthony. That was fascinating. Now, there are questions coming in, and inevitably a lot of them are sort of around COVID, but not all of them. But maybe I should just begin by sort of asking you, how do you think we can start to place the impact of coronavirus in Britain and the world on children? And how do we, what do we measure to work out whether it is ultimately, a drop in the ocean compared to climate change and poverty, or whether it's actually something more profound than that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I tweeted something today saying climate change is the stress test. Sorry, COVID is the stress test, and climate change is the crisis, because climate change is a very long-term burn. I mean, I'm a pediatrician. I'm not a meteorologist or anything, and I got interested in climate back in 2007 when I went to a meeting. I didn't think anything of it, and then I was hearing all this stuff, and it dawned upon me, and I got sucked into it really because the Lancet asked UCL to do a university-wide commission, and then I started to learn about it. And our first headline in 2009 was climate change is the greatest global threat of the 21st century. And it was interesting because although we got a lot of media coverage, there were a lot of people that said, you've got no evidence for this. And I don't think many people today would say that. I think so. In 10 years, the whole thing has changed because we've seen the Arctic, we've seen the impacts ourselves on heat waves, the food security issues, we know about sea level, and our young people are much better informed than the older generation, and they're very aware of this now. So, but I think COVID has taught us a lot. I mean, the way in which our world economy could come to a juddering halt because of one particular, virus. We also think that there are links between both overpopulation or, encroaching upon wild spaces, if you like, and wild animals. And that has a link to climate change. So, and a lot of our responses have reminded us of the importance of a clean environment. For those of us lucky enough to have access to open spaces, the silence and the green and the clean air and stuff reminds us of a past that we've forgotten about, I think. So I think they're all like,
sorry, go on.
No, I mean, I think having said that, it's put children and families, particularly the poorest, under huge strain. And I think it has taught us about the gulf in our society that it's easy to ignore, but under the strain of a stress like COVID has really come to the fore, I think.
And just bearing in mind the work of the charity, I'm thinking about the sort of the psychological impact on children. I mean, just the sense of stress and fear that the last 3 months has created. Do you think that's something that, on the whole, children who are resilient and bounce back from very easily, or should we be looking out for longer term impacts?
It's a very good question. I suspect the audience will be as genned up on this as me. I've always felt children are very resilient. I mean, the younger they are, the more resilient they are. But things do leave a lasting imprint. Being out of school for 6 months is not trivial. Fantasies and fears about, being under attack from plagues and the like. And of course, then the vulnerable children in poor circumstances or in unstable families. I mean, all of that is big and it's affected all of us. So it's difficult to predict. I'd be very interested to hear from some of our listeners today about what they think about that.
Let me go through some of the questions that are coming in. I don't know whether this is answerable in the report, but how does children's happiness in the UK compare with children in other nations and cultures?
That's a good question. There's a guy called Daniel Kahneman who he's written a best-selling book called Thinking Fast and Slow, but he also won the Nobel Prize. And he's an economist. He's a behavioral psychological economist, I think. And he tries to measure happiness. And of course, it's quite a difficult thing to do cross-country. Apparently, I may be getting this wrong because I heard him give a lecture about 10 years ago, but they tried to rate happiness. And I think the Danes were the happiest and the Nigerians were the happiest and the French were really miserable. But then they looked at the way they were interpreting a word to define happiness. And in France, it meant ecstatically happy, and the others, it said quite cheerful or something. So you were getting not a fair comparison of the two. What always struck me when, we lived in Nepal for years back in the 80s, is, there is this idea that people who live in poverty, rural poverty, have lives that are nasty, brutish, and short. But actually, the social component of traditional societies are both oppressive on certain criteria, but also very rich in other ways. And there is a social involvement, and children are cherished, and they are very peaceable, and they don't have the stresses of some of our adolescents and the like. So it's quite a difficult question, that in comparing happiness in terms of how you define it.
There's a question about the report itself, and this may be a misconception or not, but you tell us. The children sharing their values in the research seem to come from countries where there is more emphasis on the extended family system. Has there been research on the values of children raised in Western societies where the family system may be more isolated?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I've got 3 children, and 2 of them who are 28 and 23 are still living with me. So, I got out of my house when I was 18.
You won't be quitting work anytime soon then?
Yeah. So I think we're almost the boomerang generation, aren't we? Where we're recreating the extended family in certain ways. But I take your point. There's such a diversity of family situations, aren't there, all over the country and internationally. There are nuclear families in India, and very much so in China. So it's not that we are all nuclear and they're all extended, but certainly in rural settings that may be true. But what was the question in terms of it being?
Well, is the research on the report? Does the research on the report focus on developing world countries with extended families, or?
It was we were limited by 20,000 words to cover the whole of children, so we didn't go into great depth about the social differences across countries and between countries, although we do refer to it a little bit. But no, it's a difficult one to answer, in the sense that extended families have many benefits, but they also have disadvantages, particularly in terms of children's labor, for example, children's migration, the risks to children, the gender oppression. There are all kinds of traditional values that may actually not be very beneficial for children. So it's weighing up those differences. And most countries are now in quite a rapid transition. When I lived in Nepal, there was no television, there was an absolute monarch. There was, it was an incredibly traditional society. And only 30 years later, it's extremely different. And you've got all of the sort of accoutrements of modern living. They've been through a revolution. They've been through a democratic revolution. And the aspirations of young people, even in rural areas, are to migrate to urban settings and to have the kind of things that they see on social media. That was not the case then.
Lawrence Guinness asks, do you think that disadvantaged children in the UK have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19? And if so, how, and what will be the long-term consequence?
Well, they have been. The evidence, first of all, the proxy evidence on mortality shows something like double the mortality rate in the poorer parts of the country and in poorer communities. We know that in the highest mortality rates are in the Black and Afro-Caribbean communities, also in certain Asian communities and the like. The effects on children, there are some statistics that relate to opportunities of education. If you're in a private school, I think something like 90% of kids have been getting access to education and access to all the things that we take for granted, like Wi-Fi and tablets and access to doing that. In the poorest households in this country, only a third of children have any access to Wi-Fi. And one of the things Independent Sage said earlier on was, listen, get the tablets, find the companies that make them, who don't pay any taxes, by the way, and, hoover up 100,000 and distribute them through local authorities so that children have got access. It's not that simple, because if you don't have a contract, you still can't get online. But providing in public spaces, in libraries, and that's so children could get online. But I think 6 months of lost education for children is pretty considerable, and it's widening the gap. And the Sutton Trust has got quite a lot of information on this.
I mean, it's funny to think back how people laughed at the idea of free broadband just a few months ago,
Yes.
and what a difference that might have made during these last few months. There's a couple sort of head-on questions about COVID and your knowledge, particularly within the WHO. Let's just go to a couple of those. Do you think that the recent crisis has made people listen to scientists more or less? And will this affect whether they listen to them on things like climate?
Well, I would think probably less, because science has been much more exposed, and that's something that we wanted to happen. That it's not strange men usually in white coats who come and pontificate and then you all obey. It's about a debate, and we were very keen that should happen in relation to coronavirus, because there are a lot of unknowns. This was a new virus hit us. We didn't know a lot about its features or what impact it was going to have. The modelers got going, but of course modeling makes mistakes because you have to build in all kinds of assumptions. And they made some quite difficult decisions, and I think, none of it was intentional, but I think they made some mistakes. And that has obviously brought some scientists into some disrepute. I'm not sure about climate change. I think there's a generational gap here. Generally speaking, climate skeptics have gone down in number. I mean, when we put out our first report in 2009, we were bombarded by climate skeptics, and they were saying global warming's not happening. Nobody's saying that now. I mean, there are people saying, well, it doesn't matter so much, but they tend to be older men, especially. The younger generation really get this, and they're feeling disempowered. And it will be interesting to see what happens in the next year or two, I think.
When you talk about science being exposed, what is your view of the government scientists now? I mean, David King, your colleague on Sage, Independent Sage, has been very clear that he thinks the government scientists have become politicized, that they've been influenced by what they thought the politicians wanted them to say. Do you think that's happened, and how damaging is that?
It's a bit more complicated. If you look at the Sage they had, it was 24 people, of which 15, I think, or 14 were government employees. Now, when I went to WHO, by definition, I stopped being an independent scientist. My job then was to procure scientists to come in and give advice. But I was not considered independent because I worked for a UN civil service. Likewise, those 14 or so scientists around all the ministries are no longer independent because their bosses are sitting in the room. If you've got Dominic Cummings and Patrick Vallance sitting there who've appointed you, then almost by definition, they're going to be a little bit more reticent to stand up and really argue. You can argue about that, but I think that's generally accepted. So there are only about 10 independent scientists in the room. My criticism is not of them, because most of them are really good scientists and they gave their time for free and they worked very hard. But it was the balance. I think we had the wrong Sage, and they had a mindset that was geared to the wrong virus. I mean, the wrong Sage in the sense that the biggest weakness was that they employed 5 or 6 or 7 modelers and statisticians and not a single public health person. I mean, if you're going to manage an epidemic, the people who I really respect are, there are 4 people at WHO who I think are brilliant at this. And they would have been available to give advice. They weren't consulted. They didn't bring in any top public health people. And you want people who will disagree. You don't want people to all say, yes, oh yes, that's a mathematical model, we'll accept it. And that was the reason we didn't test. It was also the reason we assumed that pandemic meant it was relentlessly going to spread, even when China, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea had all already shown that you could suppress this virus. Not totally, but, and then we delayed the lockdown and the rest of it. So I'm not blaming individuals. I think the worry for them is that the people, I think the politicians have lost confidence in them, but also want to blame someone. So the politicians will try and blame SAGE. I think they'll blame Public Health England, and I think both have an uncertain future.
And the care homes today, we discovered. It was
their fault as well. Yeah, I mean, that was amazing.
Now, well, here's a blunt question. What is the truth about the WHO's role in COVID becoming a pandemic?
Well, I'm very happy to criticize WHO for many reasons, having worked there. But on this, I think they can be almost totally exonerated, except for 1 or 2 things. So the first thing is WHO has a smaller global budget than my university. It has been systematically underfunded for 25 years, and they have to get the begging bowl out whenever there's a crisis. So that's one thing. Second thing is, as soon as they got the information from China on December the 31st, the next day they set up an incident management team. They put information out into the public domain. And by January the 14th, when people have been querying whether there was human-to-human transmission, they did put that out. The problem for WHO is that it has no teeth. It has not much money and it doesn't have teeth. So in order to get information out of member states, you need to be diplomatic. Now, you could argue that Tedros, the Director General, went a bit over the top with China. And if you compare his response, which was very deferential, and he flew to China to get them to try and release information, even though internally in WHO people were pulling their hair out that the Chinese weren't releasing information fast enough. He went the diplomatic route. Gro Harlem Brundtland back in 2003 at the last SARS, she eventually lost patience and had a go at China. And then they didn't like it, but they did release information. But I don't think most of what they've said has been completely correct, that you have to find the virus, you have to test, you have to isolate people, you have to do it all at scale, and you have to do it fast. So it's very easy to use them as a scapegoat, but clearly they're being used by Trump. I mean, Trump wants a scapegoat because he's so messed up and he's going to lose the election, I think, as a result of it.
There's a couple of questions that sort of brings us back to children. Harry Wiggins asks, as far as reshaping a future around the well-being and needs of the child, how and to what extent would you suggest bringing children into the decision-making process? As adults, how do we give validity to a younger and wider international voice?
It's a good question, and I've always been a bit suspicious of tokenism. You know, at WHO or UNICEF, they would often have panels and they would bring in a child or a group of children, and they were often sort of hand-picked children of elites who could talk persuasively and they get a round of applause. I think it's much more about giving children a voice more generally, particularly older children who have tremendous creativity. I mean, you know, you'll know, well, I don't know how old your children are, but mine, once they get to teenage years, they're teaching you stuff all the time and they know all kinds of things that, You know, we don't know technological, social, cultural, and the like. And I'd be, you know, like on the whole Black Lives Matter issue, I get a huge amount of information from my children about this. So I do think it's very important to have them at the table. And I think we should do that in a much more creative and systematic way, particularly at local authority level.
Claire Odgers asks a related question, which is what do you think are the most effective ways to mobilize children's voices?
Well, I've spent my academic career doing a lot of work around mobilizing, particularly women in groups, but also other groups as well, and evaluating it using more traditional medical tools of large-scale cluster randomized trials of community stuff. So we looked, for example, in rural Nepal, we tried trials of health education, which showed no impact whatsoever. And then we mobilized women in groups, and we were convinced it wouldn't work because we didn't think we had the right numbers of groups and people, and it had a much bigger effect. And no, we published it in The Lancet, this was 20 years ago. Nobody believed us. We then repeated it in north of India, in Bangladesh, in Malawi, and we've shown pretty convincingly now, we've done about 12 of these big population studies showing impacts on newborn death rates, maternal health, and latterly, which was very interesting, last year we published a big study in Bangladesh where we mobilized women's groups and men's groups around nutrition and diabetes, because a third of people in Bangladesh over the age of 30 are diabetic or pre-diabetic. And that's not genetic, it's about being low birth weight and changing your diet. And it probably takes 3 generations to disappear. My grandfather was diabetic, my father was diabetic, I'm not yet. And I suspect this is a generational thing of shifting height and weight and all the rest of it. It's quite complicated. But mobilizing through groups is very important. And I think children will respond to being in groups and having groups facilitated by people close to their age. So you don't want people, I think most people who work with teenage groups say anyone over the age of 25 is too old. You know, you want people who are a couple of years older who can help facilitate. And I think that could be used, that's the theme of my book actually, about a lot of issues about spotting early mental health issues. You know, look at the suicide rates in universities. I think all freshers should go into groups that are supportive within their hostels and accommodation, so that they can come together and share their anxieties and the like. We're far too individualistic, and learning to be cooperative and to work in groups, I think, is something that's very important. I'm sure the listeners out there will know much more about this than me.
Well, I mean, following on from that, and actually something in the presentation about social media, Isabel Taylor has written to say, thank you so much for an interesting analysis. Fascinating to see climate change and COVID contextualized in this way. I was surprised not to see any reference to sex-based differences in the threats to children, such as FGM, trafficking, child marriage, or the development of social media culture and its impact on mental well-being. Are these much smaller risks by comparison to the other big general risks?
No, it's a good point. And also, no, gender issues are huge. They're more complex than you think. I mean, I remember in India, we were looking at a lot of things to show that the girl child was much more discriminated against, which was socially true, but biologically not necessarily so. Although in some communities it was the case, but not across the board. Gender issues kick in earlier than we think. They're very important. They're still present in this country. Misogyny is a huge problem. It infects all of our institutions. And of course, the whole recent focus on our distorted history and the Black Lives Matter issues, and about discrimination within societies and between societies and between migrant groups and between groups of different color and the like, are all immensely important. I mean, we didn't cover a lot of that in this report because we were looking at more structural stuff around at a higher level to get something moving. But I think these are extremely important. And, you know, there's a long, long way to go. I think it's interesting that, you know, we've had a Black American president before a woman president. And I've often argued that discrimination against women is the kind of the last thing in getting to a properly egalitarian society. But every country I've lived in or worked in has different kinds of discrimination. It seems to be a human characteristic of hierarchy, of caste, of class in this country, which is still very, very present, as we can see in our governance structures and in our social apartheid of our schools, which I think is a big issue. And we've never really grappled with that. Sorry, I'm
just on the sort of, well, just on the sort of the, I mean, to try and sort of tie it together really in a way in terms of sort of children's voices and the impacts of the last few months. I mean, you know, some people have wondered whether the continued closure of schools and leisure facilities, which are, you know, two things obviously hugely important to children, has continued in part because children don't have a voice and nobody has been able to speak up and say how important it is, how much more important it was than opening the pubs. Do you think there is good scientific reason for keeping those things closed, and it's right, or do you think that this is a lack of advocacy?
No, that's a really good question. I think it is the latter. I think, we said about a month ago, over a month ago, that we were worried about opening on June the 1st, simply because the risks we had measured and quantified of exposure, risk of infection and taking it home to multi-generational households was too high. And we said, if we wait 2 weeks, it will halve. And then we thought it was reasonable. If you're in an area where there's not too much infection, then you could open the schools. And then we said, look, the most important thing is the biggest risk is being indoors. If you're outdoors, you can do an awful lot more. And children are the least risky bit of the population to contract the illness. So the risks to them of becoming sick were very, very low. And historically, we've had open schools for tuberculosis, for, you know, going back 100 years, we had open schools. Look, we're in the summer. We've got another 2.5 months till September. We've got parks, we've got sports facilities, we've got schools with grounds. Why can't we be organizing events for children, festivals, sports events, and also teaching in open areas or in very well ventilated classrooms? And I think we haven't shown much imagination here. And of course, then we'll say, well, we've got another 7 weeks of holiday. And I sympathize with the teachers. I was talking to a teacher last night who's a maths teacher, and he said he's never worked so hard because he's doing lots online. But he works in a private school, you know, and so I think we have neglected our children, and the British are famous for this. I mean, a lot of, going back 500 years, people have been writing about how when, you know, Europeans come here, they think we basically sideline our children.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Anthony. Our time is up, so we will leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for kicking off this series of summer talks and lectures. It's been really interesting talking to you. I hope you enjoyed that. Those of you watching, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you for your support. These events continue with a series of different guests and different chairs. I think Alan Johnson is here this time next week with his very entertaining and perceptive take on life and the world. So please do continue to support the events and the charity, and I hope they are all as successful as this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.